Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to speak to Bill C-45, which we all know by now, anyone who's watching in or anyone in this House knows. It's the Conservative government's second omnibus budget implementation bill. And judging by the bill's 414 pages in length and 516 clauses that amend over 60 different pieces of legislation, it is clear that the Conservatives don't get it, and I fear never will. Despite the recent Liberal motion condemning omnibus legislation, and in spite of Canadians' overwhelming opposition to Bill C-38, the government's last omnibus budget implementation bill, the Conservative government introduced yet another undemocratic omnibus bill. When Canadians worry about the way this government is writing legislation, ministers of this government throw their hands up in the air and tell Canadians not to concern themselves with process. But, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are concerned about process. They understand that the process of elections, the process of debate, the process of accountability, the process of parliamentary study and consultation are the roots of Canadian democracy and go hand in hand with the success and stability of our economy. So when this Conservative government tells worried Canadians not to concern themselves with process, Canadians sit up and take note. Right. In the face of unyielding abuses of power by Conservative government, Liberals continue to fight for democracy and our economy, and in so doing for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Hear, hear. For example, Liberals introduced a successful motion to separate MP pension changes from the budget implementation bill so that these important changes could be fast-tracked through Parliament. We were pleased that the government worked with us on this particular issue. In an attempt to ensure proper debate and consultation on Bill C-45, we requested that many unregulated budgetary measures be presented in separate, standalone legislation. While the Prime Minister rejected Liberal calls for a more democratic approach, we were nevertheless encouraged that at least he agreed to allow Bill C-45 to be studied by 11 separate parliamentary standing committees. Unfortunately, it became clear that the government's permission for the bill to be studied by committees was nothing more than a public relations ploy. Tragically, the government's refusal to split this enormous bill means only the Finance Committee had the order of reference from the House. This meant that only the Finance Committee could make amendments to this legislation. For instance, had the Fisheries Committee discovered an error in Division 4, which amends consequential provisions relating to the destruction of fish habitat under the Fisheries Act, the Fisheries Committee would have been unable to correct the legislation. Bill C-45 is flawed, and that is why Liberals introduced over 3,000 amendments at committee. Hear, hear. It was our hope that some of these amendments would find bipartisan support in an effort to introduce the best legislation possible. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives proved yet again that when it comes to working together, they have no interest in doing so. Many Canadian families are still feeling the harsh effects of the economic downturn and are struggling to make ends meet. I know in my riding of Randaburen St. George's, people were hoping the Conservative government would surprise them and show leadership for change and introduce a budget implementation bill that would help to create jobs. Unfortunately, Bill C-45 does very little to help create jobs and does even less to help struggling families feeling the burden of the growing gap between the rich and the low and middle income Canadians. Under this Conservative government, the Canadian economy is struggling. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is predicting a slower rate of growth that will cost the Canadian economy $22 billion every year. Even the Finance Minister is predicting a slower growth rate and has stopped being so bullish about his deficit targets, embarrassingly conceding yet again he will not be meeting his own deficit targets. While this bill is known as an implementation bill, it may be more accurately described as a budget correction bill. Bill C-45 is tasked with cleaning up Conservative legislative mistakes in Bill C-38. Some of the measures Bill C-45 seeks to correct include errors that amended Fisheries Act regarding the travel of fish species in or through bodies of water, and as well, fixing poor drafting of the new environmental assessment law's transition provisions and the unclear ministerial approval process for specific investments by public investment pools. Part of the problem with omnibus legislation, Mr. Speaker, is that because of the sheer size and scope of the legislation, Parliament cannot properly scrutinize the legislation and make sure it actually achieves the desired outcome. And that is what we've been asking for, the opportunity to work with the government, to work with all parties in the House of Commons, to make sure that we have the best piece of legislation you can possibly have for Canadians who elect us to do just that, Mr. Speaker. When you combine the more than 400 pages of Bill C-38 with the Conservatives' penchant for limiting debate and ignoring facts that do not fit into their ideology, it is not hard to understand why Bill C-38 had so many mistakes. Right. Mistakes that now have to be corrected. Instead of the government presenting Canadians with legislation focused on jobs and the economy, they are attempting to correct mistakes that they should not have made in the first place. Mistakes that are now taking up the time of the House of Commons when we should be debating other important pieces of legislation. This should have been dealt with, Mr. Speaker, and not now have to come back where members of Parliament have to stand and point again to errors of this Conservative government. Had the government split the bill as the Liberals requested, the government would not have had so many sloppy mistakes. Right. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, many of the measures introduced in this most recent omnibus bill, Bill C-45, do not belong in a budget implementation bill because they have nothing to do with the process of implementing a budget. The finance minister's claim that all measures introduced in Bill C-45 were in the budget is simply not the case. For example, changes to the definition of Aboriginal fishery were not in the budget and do not impact acts under the Finance Department. Changes to the land designations in the Indian Act were not in the budget. I note that both of these changes to legislation affecting First Nations peoples were done unilaterally without consultation and, in fact, violate the constitutional responsibility to consult Aboriginal peoples. And that is a blatant failure of this government, Mr. Speaker, the failure to consult with Canadians from coast to coast to coast on issues that impact them on a daily basis, that impact every facet of their lives. But still, this government just straight ahead does what it wants to do without consulting those who are going to be most directly impacted. Another interesting example of a measure that was not in the budget but appears in this budget implementation bill is the suspension of the Canada Employment Insurance Financing Board. Not only is the elimination of this board not in the budget actually promised the exact opposite. On page 146 of the budget it states, and I quote, "Over the next few years, the Canada Employment Insurance Financing Board will continue to set the rate," end of quote. Bill C-45 eliminates this board and centralizes the rate setting responsibility in the hands of the Cabinet. In addition, this board set the employment insurance rate and was supposed to invest employment insurance surpluses. But under the Conservative government, so many people have been without work that the board has never had a surplus to invest. Mr. Speaker, instead of addressing the harsh fiscal realities of many Canadians, BC-45 continues the Conservatives' reckless abuse of power, cutting important job creation tax credits like the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, the Atlantic Investment Tax Credit, and the Corporate Mineral Exploration and Development Tax Credit will not help our economy thrive. I, Mr. Speaker, cannot support a piece of legislation that does more to harm jobs than to help create them. Thank you.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Saint-Lambert.
The honourable member for Saint-Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. Mr. Speaker, using a time allocation motion and doing it too often is anti-democratic. This massive bill will make major changes to various pieces of legislation, and this was never really discussed democratically among Canadians or here in the House. I'd also like to say that this bill, which the Conservatives say will create jobs, well, the Parliamentary Budget Officer argues that the budget will actually lead to the loss of 43,000 jobs in Canada. So in reality, this budget would increase unemployment. My colleague talked about this. Could she say anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question. And it's obvious when anyone takes the time, and it takes a lot of time to look at a budget bill this size, and everything, all of the various clauses that it contains. But it is clear for anyone who takes the time to go through it clause by clause by clause that you realize that the intention of this government is not to help create jobs, but instead to cut jobs. And that is precisely what we are seeing throughout the country, Mr. Speaker. If you look at Service Canada, for instance, we are seeing so many job losses just in Service Canada alone. And then on the other hand, we're seeing job cuts in EI. We're seeing where public service personnel respond to issues with respect to unemployment insurance. We're seeing job cuts from veterans' offices. We're seeing job cuts across the board, but people are being directed to go to Service Canada. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that they're cutting resources at Service Canada as well. So Canadians are being impacted not only by loss of jobs, but by loss of public services that they are entitled to, that they've been used to receiving. But now this government is telling them, well, go online, forgetting that a lot of people still do not access, particularly in rural communities, computers or online, and then telling them to go, well, go to Service Canada, where you will in fact find fewer employees to deal with the issues that they need help with, Mr. Speaker.
I will. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Avalon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to participate in this debate as well. And I'd like to ask my colleague and friend from Random Bureau in St. George's, one of the most devastating cuts that we've seen to services in Newfoundland and Labrador in the recent budget cuts is the closure of the Marine Search and Rescue Substation in St. John's, and it impacts all of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the closure of the one in Quebec City as well. And I wonder, I know the member has worked hard and worked with those individuals that were displaced, and wonder if she had any thoughts on that.
Honourable member for Random Bureau in St. George's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague from Avalon, who is more than well-versed in what has transpired in Newfoundland and Labrador with respect to cuts to search and rescue. In fact, the closure of the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in St. John's struck such a blow to everyone in Newfoundland and Labrador, but not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, because that search and rescue centre provided a service for anyone who traveled on the North Atlantic. And we are now in a position in Newfoundland and Labrador where we continue to fight the good fight, but we have a Conservative government that just turns a blind eye and pretends not to hear the outcries that are coming from those who know precisely what will happen. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, what will happen as a result of that closure is that we are going to end up with a tragedy that may well point to the need or try and convince this government of the need to reinstate that Maritime Rescue Subcentre. What we're finding in Quebec, thank heavens, is that they've been given a reprieve, that centre is not closing. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not because of the good nature or the good wishes of the Conservative government that they're not doing that. The reality is that they could not find competent French-speaking personnel to be part of the Trenton Rescue Centre. So it's not because they don't want to close Quebec, it's because they really don't have a choice at this point.